Here's another dip, doing 25 miles an hour. Wow, the front is way more controlled. Way more controlled. Today we're looking at the front suspension on my 1995 GMC Suburban. I recently installed a Rough Country 2 to 3 inch lift kit on this thing. It's mainly a torsion bar lift, but it does include new upper control arms as well as drop brackets for the front differential. So it's a proper torsion bar lift, but I am having a little bit of a problem with the front suspension. Now the problem I'm having mostly has to do with drivability on the road. I'm learning more and more about how all this stuff works as time goes on and the more I drive this vehicle, but to my best understanding and common sense, this is pretty much what I've come up with. You see, with a lift like this, we have a torsion bar, which is right there, and that torsion bar gets cranked to essentially lower the front wheels. But a side effect of cranking those torsion bars, lowering the wheels, and essentially giving yourself more articulation means that when you hit a bump, this wheel can wind up that torsion bar a lot more than it could before, and that torsion bar essentially springs back a lot more than it ever did before. So you really need a super high quality shock in order to counteract that extra energy. You also need a shock that is the correct length. Now, so far, with my very limited experience with these shocks supplied by Rough Country, I would say they're pretty good. But for some reason, when I hit, for example, a speed bump or even on the freeway and the road gets kind of wavy, I feel my front tires coming off the ground. Now, that can be attributed to a couple of things. Number one, I'm hitting the droop stops with my upper control arms on the downward motion. And number two, a shock that just can't handle it. I'm not saying these shocks can't handle it, but right now, as I look at it, they seem to be a little too long. Looking inside, we can see there is a supplied extension bracket that was made specifically for this lift kit and this shock. Right now the vehicle is jacked up, and so we are at full articulation with our downward travel. So you can see our upper control arm is resting on the droop stop. The point is, this shock is as long as it's gonna get, and I don't really think that's necessarily correct. The top of the valve body is about there, and the bottom of the shock is about there, so you can see that there's not much of that shock left. It's probably compressed about halfway. Now with that, I can do a couple of things. I can either remove that shock extension and try to get this shock to fit in there without that extension, or I can replace the shock with my original Bilstein 4600s. If I go ahead and line up the bottom bolt hole, we can see that the top of this Bilstein shock is plenty long, being that the suspension is fully drooped. In other words, I will never max out this Bilstein shock at full droop because it's hitting the droop stop. So just for S's and G's, I think that's the route I'm gonna go. And doing it this way will allow me to test the difference between a good set of Bilstein shocks that are only a few years old and these supplied Rough Country shocks. Pry bar in there. Pull this bolt out. Here I have this Rough Country shock fully extended. Now it is definitely, probably 3 inches past the actual bolt hole. And you might think that's actually not so bad, but keep in mind, this is full droop. This is the front control arm resting on the droop stop, and we still have length to spare. Now, like I already said, I don't know if this is bad or not, or great. Maybe this is exactly how your shocks are supposed to be set up. But when this shock is fully installed, resting on the vehicle's weight, I believe it's compressed probably halfway, if not more. Okay, so taking a look at the difference between the Bilstein and the Rough Country shock, we can see the Rough Country is probably, I don't know, 1.5 to 2 inches longer. And so therein lies my curiosity. The Rough Country shock is 2 inches longer than the Bilstein. Not only that, but we do have a shock extension that I believe raises it another 2 inches, if not 3. Is that okay for the shock in its resting position with the vehicle weight on it to be halfway compressed? I don't know. The only way I can figure this out, because I've already done research online and there's basically nothing I can find about it, is to do it myself. I'm gonna put this Bilstein shock on and drive it around and see what it feels like. The bottom bolt is now in this Bilstein shock, and you can see it is fully extended. Of course, at full droop, we still have probably a little better than an inch to go with the shock. So the theory in my mind is once the vehicle's full weight is on this shock, it's gonna be in a much better position than the rough country shock. Well, that's the theory anyway. Okay, this passenger side Bilstein is fully installed. Now all we have to do is install the driver's side. Okay, so I've been driving around my neighborhood for a little bit just to try to get a really good sense for what's going on, the difference between the Bilsteins and the rough country. And I have to say, the Bilsteins are better. Now, I kind of knew this. Bilstein is a great, great shock that's been around for a long time. The rough country isn't bad. I would say more of a weaker shock, and the Bilstein just has a lot more control. When I hit bumps, dips, it seems to grab on and hold, whereas the rough country would kind of just bounce all over the place and a lot less controlled, I would say, especially for just my setup with the lift that I have and how my torsion keys are cranked. Maybe it would work really good for some people, and I'm not complaining about the rough country shocks. I actually put them on and thought, wow, these feel kind of cushy, like kind of nice. But now switching back to these Bilsteins, I can tell for sure. Here's a big dip. Oh yeah. I mean, see, I still have the rough countries in the back, and I can tell in the back, I'm getting a lot more bounce with the suspension, whereas the front is very, very controlled. There is quite a big difference in both of these shocks, for sure. Here's another dip, doing 25 miles an hour. Wow, the front is way more controlled, way more controlled, and I wasn't expecting that. I mean, I thought the rough countries were really good. I still do think that they're good. They're different. I know that in their description they say that they kind of valve them for on-street and off-street off-road use. I'm assuming that they're trying to get the best of both worlds, which I totally respect. I just think that when it comes down to it, these Bilstein 4600s are just doing a better job. They fit great. They're not being hyperextended or overextended or anything like that. And they are controlling the front end a heck of a lot more. I can tell a huge difference in both of these shocks. I mean, a huge difference, especially on the big stuff. The small stuff, obviously, the little road cracks and stuff like that, I mean, you're not really gonna be able to tell a difference. But when you hit the big dips and stuff like that, going 20, 25 miles an hour, I mean, it's a major, major difference. I want to attribute it to almost like the rough countries having like no shock on there. Although it doesn't really feel like that. It's just a heck of a lot less controlled. And that's the best way to put it. Just a lot less controlled, especially, you know, once you compress, it doesn't keep it down. It'll just kind of let it bounce back up. And that's where I'm hitting the bump stops on the downward motion, or the droop stops. So these Bilsteins are actually doing quite a good job keeping me from nailing those droop stops on the downward motion when I come back down. I'm gonna be keeping these Bilsteins on, and now that presents another problem. Do my current rear Bilsteins fit back there with a 2-inch block on those leaf springs? I'm gonna have to check and find out, because yeah, I mean, just based off of these front Bilsteins, I mean, it's night and day. When you get a chance like this to really just back to back see the difference, it's pretty shocking, it's pretty astonishing. I'm stoked right now, I really am. It might not look like it in my face, but that's just because my arm is freaking on fire from holding this camera. So I'm gonna go, guys. I'm Jimmy, my channel is One Road, and I thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. All right, you thought this video was over, but it is not. So I have my truck jacked up to give it full articulation. You can see this tire is actually just off the ground, and I want to measure the shock compared to the Bilstein. So as far up as I can put this thing with maximum articulation, you can see we're probably maxed out on the Bilstein shock. So I'm trying to rack my brain here and see when this would really ever matter. I don't really ever plan on having my wheels off the ground. But if I lose an inch of articulation on each side, is that big of a deal? Essentially, the shock would act as a stopper. So these Rough Country shocks, I believe, are about 2 inches longer than the Bilsteins. So right now, I believe the limit on this articulation is actually the leaf springs and not the shock stopping it. Whereas if I install the Bilsteins with this 2-inch block, I believe the Bilstein will be what stops, you know, the articulation. So I'm thinking I'm just gonna go for it. Test fit this thing. Just as I suspected, we're about an inch, actually a little more than that. Man, that's quite a bit actually. Okay, so we got the bottom of the shock in, kind of setting in place where it would be. It is fully extended and you can see there is some space there. I'm gonna go ahead and measure that. Okay, so to my eye, it looks like we're about 1 1/4 inches too short. It's kind of a lot. Okay, so here you can see just how much longer the Rough Country shock is than the Bilstein. It is actually long enough and then some. When I pulled it out, it extended itself probably another inch. So with the Bilstein as it sits, we're gonna be 1 1/4 inches too short with full articulation. I'm not super sure that really matters all that much, but I think what I'm gonna do is swap the Rough Country back in and do a little more research, and maybe there's a shock extender or something like that that's a 2-inch shock extender for the rear of these vehicles. I don't know, but I'll have to look into that. And with that, this video is over.